Alexander the Great, the boy who conquered the earth. There is a name that history has never truly let go of, a name spoken in the war rooms of generals, in the dreams of emperors, in the private journals of Napoleon Bonaparte, who wept, it is said, when he visited Alexander's tomb and realized that at the same age he himself had conquered nothing. A name that Caesar reportedly stared at in silent grief when he came across a statue of the man in a Spanish temple. A name so monumental, so mythic, so nearly impossible to place within the confines of a single human lifetime, that for more than 2,000 years the world has been unable to decide whether Alexander of Macedon was a god walking among men, or simply the greatest man who ever lived. He was called the Great. He was called the son of Zeus. He was called the Lord of Asia, Iskander by the Persians who feared him, Dul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, in the traditions of the ancient Near East. The Egyptians crowned him pharaoh without a battle, their priests declaring him the son of Amun-Ra, a living deity descended from the sky. To the Macedonian soldiers who followed him barefoot across deserts and mountain passes and rivers they could not name, he was simply the king, and that was more than enough. He was born in the summer of 3056 BC into a world that was already extraordinary. His father, Philip II, was a military genius who had dragged the rugged kingdom of Macedon from obscurity and made it the most feared power in Greece. His mother, Olympias, was a fierce, tempestuous woman from the royal house of Epirus, who told her young son from his earliest years that his blood was not merely mortal, that Zeus himself had fathered him, that greatness was not something he would have to earn, but something written into the very architecture of his soul. Whether Alexander believed it is almost beside the point. He behaved as though he did. By the age of 16, he was left to govern Macedon in his father's absence, and within months had crushed a tribal rebellion and founded his first city. At 18, he rode into the Battle of Chaeronea and personally shattered the sacred band of Thebes, an elite force of 150 pairs of lovers who had never once been defeated in open battle, men so bound to one another they had sworn to die rather than retreat. He broke them in an afternoon. His father was assassinated when Alexander was 20. 2 years later, he crossed the Hellespont into Persia with an army of roughly 37,000 men and began what would become the most audacious, most relentless, and most staggering military campaign in the history of human civilization. He would fight the Persian Empire, then the mightiest empire on earth, and he would not stop. He won at the Granicus River, where his helmet was split by an enemy axe, and he barely survived. He won at Issus, where the Persian king Darius III fled in such haste that he left his mother, his wife, and his daughters behind on the battlefield, and Alexander treated them with the full honor of royalty. He won at Gaugamela, outnumbered, outflanked on every side, where he led the decisive charge himself into the seam of the Persian line, like a man who simply could not imagine that the world would let him lose. He took Egypt, he took Babylon, he took Persepolis, the beating heart of the empire, and burned the great palace there, a decision that still divides historians to this day. He pushed into Central Asia, into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, fighting in mountain passes where the cold killed men quietly in the night, and the enemy knew every shadow of the terrain. He crossed the Hindu Kush. He crossed the Indus River. He stood at the edge of India and wanted, hungered, to go further still. His army refused, and it was perhaps the only force on earth capable of stopping him. In 13 years of continuous campaigning, Alexander the Great never lost a single battle. He conquered approximately 2 million square miles of territory. He founded over 70 cities, many of which still exist today. He was dead at 32. This is a story about ambition so complete, so consuming, and so brilliant that the ancient world genuinely struggled to find the language for it. It is a story about a boy raised on myths who became one. about a king who reached the edge of the known world and stood there, squinting into the distance, wondering what was beyond it. This is the story of Alexander. And we are still, after all this time, trying to understand him, the making of a king, childhood, dreams, and the education of Alexander. To understand Alexander, you must first understand the world he was born into, not the world of battles and thrones. That world would come soon enough, arriving at a gallop with blood on its hands. The world of his childhood. The world of Pella. In the 4th century BC, Pella was the capital of Macedon, a city that had been transformed within a single generation from a backwater provincial town into one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the Greek-speaking world. Its streets were wide and ordered, its palace mosaics, many of which survive to this day, buried under northern Greek soil until the archaeologists came, depicted hunting scenes and mythological battles with a precision and artistry that could hold their own against anything produced in Athens or Corinth. There were gardens, colonnades, fountains, great halls where ambassadors from Egypt and Persia and the far corners of the Mediterranean came to drink and negotiate, and, often, to marvel quietly at how quickly this kingdom had risen. It was into this city, into this palace, into this particular convergence of ambition and culture and barely contained violence that Alexander was born. The ancient sources, Plutarch above all, writing 4 centuries later, but drawing on earlier accounts and eyewitness traditions, tell us that the night before Alexander's birth, his mother Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb and igniting a great fire that spread across the world before vanishing. His father Philip, away on campaign, dreamed that same night of sealing his wife's womb with a signet ring engraved with the image of a lion. Dream interpreters, when consulted, offered suitably grand interpretations. The lion meant the child would be of leonine character. The thunderbolt meant he was touched by Zeus, the fire spreading across the earth. Well, you can decide for yourself whether that one came true. On the day of Alexander's birth, it was said that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The Magi who traveled through Ephesus that day reportedly tore their garments in grief and went running through the streets crying that disaster had come, that the destroyer of Asia had been born. The temple burned, they said, because Artemis was away from her post that night, attending the birth of Alexander. We should be careful, of course, with stories like these. The ancient world had a deep and earnest appetite for omens, for signs woven into the fabric of great lives from their very first moments. Every significant figure accumulated them, and the more significant the figure, the more elaborate the signs became. Alexander himself, as we will see, had a complicated relationship with his own mythology, sometimes cultivating it with a showman's sharp instinct, sometimes appearing to genuinely believe it with a devotion that went all the way down into his bones. But strip away the omens, and what remains is still remarkable. A boy born into a family of extraordinary people, in a kingdom at the precise moment of its greatest expansion, surrounded from his earliest years by men and women who talked about conquest and power and glory as naturally as other people talked about the weather. His mother shaped him first. Olympias of Epirus was a woman who exists in the historical record as something between a political operator and a force of nature, and the line between those two things, where she was concerned, was never entirely clear. She came from the royal house of the Molossians in Epirus, a region to the west that was considered half-wild by the more settled Greek cities, and she carried something of that wildness with her throughout her life. She was intensely religious, devoted to the ecstatic mystery cults of Dionysus and Orphism that were popular in the Greek world's more fervent margins, cults that involved torchlight processions, snake-handling rituals, and states of religious frenzy that the more sober Athenian philosophers regarded with a mixture of condescension and unease. It was this intensity, this almost volcanic inner life, that Alexander absorbed before he could speak. Olympias told her son stories, not merely the myths and legends that every Greek child was raised on, though those too, those always, but something more personal and more potent. She told him who he was. She told him that the blood of heroes ran in his veins, that his descent was not merely royal but divine, that the great Achilles himself was his ancestor through her line, and that through his father Philip he could trace his lineage back to Heracles, to Hercules, the son of Zeus, the man who had literally cleaned up the world by strangling its monsters and pushing back its chaos with his bare hands. This was not unusual in the ancient world. Royal families routinely claimed divine descent. What was unusual was the way Olympias told it, not as a pleasant genealogical footnote, not as a ceremonial boast, but as a living, breathing, urgent truth. She wanted Alexander to feel it. She wanted it to sit inside him like a coal, warming him from within, never quite letting him forget that he was different, that ordinary limits applied to ordinary people, and that he was not ordinary. Whether this was love or ambition or some inseparable combination of both is a question that historians have argued for centuries and will never conclusively settle. What we know is the effect. Alexander grew up genuinely believing he was descended from heroes and gods, and that belief, held not as arrogance but as a kind of solemn personal responsibility, would drive everything he did. You do not conquer the known world because you are confident. You conquer it because you are afraid of failing the standard set for you before you were born. His father's influence was different in texture but equally formative. Philip II of Macedon was, by any serious measure, one of the greatest military and political minds of the ancient world. He had spent years as a young man as a hostage in Thebes, at the time the dominant military power in Greece, and rather than wasting those years in resentment, he had studied everything. He had watched the great general Epaminondas revolutionize warfare, understood the geometries of the oblique attack and the staggered phalanx, and carried those lessons back to Macedon when his captivity ended, transforming what had been a competent provincial army into the most sophisticated fighting machine the Greek world had yet produced. He was also a man of enormous personal energy and appetite for war, for politics, for wine, for women, for spectacle. He had multiple wives. Marriage in Macedon was a political instrument more than a personal one, and his relationship with Olympias was by all accounts a tempestuous and complicated one, a union of two strong, proud people who each believed the world ought to arrange itself around their particular vision of things. Philip and Olympias fought. They negotiated. They used their son as both a bond between them and, at times, as a piece of leverage in their private war. The young Alexander navigated this with a sensitivity that those who met him as a child noted and remarked upon. A perceptiveness about people, about their moods and motivations and unspoken feelings, that would later become one of his most powerful leadership tools. He watched his father constantly. This is important. He did not merely hear about war and conquest in the abstract. He watched a master practice it in real time. Philip would return from campaigns, sometimes missing an eye or walking with a new limp, and there would be celebrations, new territories added to the maps, foreign ambassadors in the halls, the sounds of a kingdom growing. Alexander absorbed all of it. He asked questions. He studied his father's battles. He began, almost from the moment he was old enough to hold a conversation, drawing the outlines of a different question, one that would define the rest of his life. The question was simple. If his father had done all this, what was left for him? There is a story, told by multiple ancient sources, and almost certainly true in its essential character, even if embellished in its details, that when word reached the young Alexander of one of Philip's great military victories, his companions expected him to be delighted. Instead, the boy grew quiet and troubled. When his friends asked what was wrong, he told them that he was afraid his father would conquer everything and leave nothing great for him to do. He was, at this point, barely a teenager. The anecdote tells you almost everything you need to know about Alexander. The scale of his ambition was not external. It was not a response to opportunity or circumstance. It was internal, permanent, intrinsic. It was, in the most literal sense, who he was. While other boys dreamed of being warriors or athletes or wealthy men, Alexander dreamed of running out of world. Before the greatest tutor in the history of the world arrived to formalize that education, however, there was the matter of Homer. If there is a single cultural inheritance that explains Alexander more than any other, it is the Iliad, Homer's great epic, the story of the Trojan War, and specifically of the rage and grief and glory of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, was not merely a book in the ancient Greek world. It was a sacred text, a moral guide, a psychological companion, a vision of what excellence and courage and honor looked like when they burned at their absolute brightest. Greek boys were raised on it the way other cultures raised children on scripture, and its verses were memorized, recited, debated, and wept over from one end of the Greek-speaking world to the other. But Alexander did not merely love the Iliad, he consumed it. He internalized it. He identified with it in a way that went so deep that scholars are still debating 2 millennia later where the performance ended and the genuine belief began. His hero was Achilles, not as a character in a story, but as a standard, a measuring rod, the template against which Alexander held up his own life and found it, always, not yet sufficient. Achilles, in Homer's telling, is the archetype of what the ancient Greeks called arete, excellence, virtue, the full flowering of human potential. He is faster, stronger, and more beautiful than other men. He is offered a choice between a long, comfortable, forgettable life and a short one blazing with glory, and he chooses the short life without hesitation, because what is a life without glory? What is existence without the knowledge that you have pushed against the limits of what a human being can be, and found those limits wanting? Alexander made the same choice, consciously and explicitly. From the time he was old enough to make choices, he kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow throughout his campaigns, annotated, it is said, by his tutor Aristotle, alongside a dagger. When he crossed the Hellespont into Asia at the start of his great campaign, the first thing he did was stop at Troy. He made offerings of the tomb of Achilles. He ran naked around the tomb, as Greek custom prescribed for honoring the dead, and garlanded the grave marker. He called Achilles fortunate. And what he meant was not fortunate to be dead, but fortunate to have had Homer to tell his story, to have had his glory preserved in language that would last as long as language lasted. This was a young man of 22, about to begin the conquest of the Persian Empire, and his primary concern in that moment was that someone would tell his story well enough. The ambition was never simply territorial. It was always, at its deepest level, about transcendence. And now we must speak of Aristotle. In 343 BC, when Alexander was approximately 13 years old, his father Philip sent a message to a philosopher living in the coastal town of Ateneus in Asia Minor. The message was an invitation, or perhaps, given that Philip was writing it and Philip had an army, something rather closer to a summons. "Come to Macedon," it said, in effect. "Teach my son." The philosopher's name was Aristotle of Stagira, and he was, at that moment, already well on his way to becoming the most comprehensive intellect the ancient world would produce. He had studied for 20 years at Plato's Academy in Athens. He had developed his own methods of inquiry, his own philosophical frameworks, his own systematic approaches to biology, ethics, politics, physics, rhetoric, and the nature of the human soul. He was not yet the towering figure posterity would make him. That status would come later, partly through the influence of his famous pupil, but he was already clearly something exceptional. He was also, it should be noted, from Stagira, a town in Macedon that Philip had razed to the ground some years earlier in the course of his territorial expansions. Philip, with characteristic pragmatism and a warlord's understanding that people remember their grudges, offered to rebuild Stagira in exchange for Aristotle's agreement to come and teach Alexander. He also reportedly repopulated the town with some of its displaced citizens and freed certain Stagirans who had been enslaved. Aristotle came. Philip prepared a place for the education to take place. The sanctuary of the nymphs at Mieza, a quiet, wooded location with covered walkways and gardens, the kind of place where thought could breathe. It became, for the next 3 years or so, one of the most remarkable educational establishments the world has ever seen. A school of one, well, of one principal student at any rate. Alexander was accompanied at Mieza by a group of carefully selected companions, the sons of Macedonian nobility who would grow up to become his generals, his diplomats, his closest friends, and in some cases the men who would tear his empire apart after his death. Their names are worth pausing on, because they are names that will matter enormously in the story ahead. Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest companion, and arguably the great love of his life. Ptolemy, who would survive Alexander and found the dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries. Cassander, whose relationship with Alexander was always complicated, always carrying a current of tension beneath the surface. Nearchus, who would command Alexander's fleet. They were boys together at Mieza, learning to think, and Aristotle taught them everything he had. This is not a casual claim. Aristotle's range was genuinely astonishing by the standards of any age. He had thoughts, many of them still influential, about biology and zoology. He dissected animals, classified species, made observations about marine life that would not be surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. He had theories about physics and cosmology, about the nature of matter and motion and the structure of the heavens. He had developed a systematic approach to logic, to the structure of valid argument, that would undergird Western philosophy and science for the better part of 2 millennia. He wrote about ethics, about what constituted the good life and the good society, with a practical seriousness that distinguished him sharply from the more idealist Platonic tradition he had been trained in. He wrote about rhetoric, about how to persuade human beings, about the architecture of a compelling argument, and the psychology of an audience. He wrote about literature. His Poetics remains one of the foundational texts of Western literary criticism. All of this he brought to the wooded sanctuary at Mieza and laid before a 13-year-old boy. What did Aristotle actually teach Alexander? The ancient sources are not always specific, but they give us threads to follow. He taught him medicine, and Alexander's interest in medicine remained active and practical. His entire life, he would frequently involve himself personally in the treatment of his wounded soldiers, a habit that amazed and moved the men who served him. He taught him philosophy. Though Alexander's relationship with philosophy was always more pragmatic than contemplative, he valued ideas that helped him understand the world and the people in it, and was less drawn to the purely abstract. He taught him botany and biology, and Alexander would later instruct his officers to collect plant and animal specimens from conquered territories and send them back to Aristotle for study, an early example of systematic natural history collection that required an empire to be possible. He taught him rhetoric and the craft of argument, skills Alexander would deploy throughout his career with a precision that repeatedly disarmed opponents who had expected a barbarian warlord, and found instead a man who could debate philosophy at dinner and break through a cavalry line at dawn. He also taught him literature, deepening and complicating the boy's already fierce love of Homer. It was Aristotle who apparently prepared the annotated copy of the Iliad that Alexander would carry with him across Asia, the great philosopher's marginal notes. Imagine them. Aristotle's commentary on Homer, written for Alexander, are lost to us, which is one of the more painful absences in the history of ideas. What did Aristotle write in the margins? What did he highlight, question, elaborate, contest? We will never know. But we know that Alexander treasured the book, that he read it repeatedly, that it never left his inner circle of possessions, sleeping under his pillow alongside that dagger, as though Homer were a weapon and a guardian both. There is a touching detail in the ancient sources about the relationship between teacher and student. Alexander, later in life, would say that he loved Aristotle no less than he loved his father, for from his father he had received the gift of life, but from Aristotle he had received the gift of living well. This is a generous, philosophically literate sentiment, and it tells you something important. The education at Mieza was not merely technical. It was formative in the deepest sense. Aristotle helped Alexander understand what excellence was for, what knowledge was for, what the point of being alive and capable was. And yet, and this is the complexity that makes Alexander endlessly fascinating, the student would eventually go far beyond anything his teacher had imagined or intended. Aristotle, for all his genius, was in certain respects a man of conventional Greek assumptions. He believed, for instance, that Greek people were naturally suited to freedom and self-governance, while Asian peoples were naturally suited to despotism, and that this was simply a feature of the world as it was. He advised Alexander to treat Greeks as free men and barbarians, everyone else as slaves or animals. Alexander would not only ignore this advice, he would actively contradict it in almost every major political decision he made as king. He would marry Persian women. He would adopt Persian court customs. He would appoint Persians to positions of military and administrative authority. He would attempt, with varying degrees of success and controversy, to fuse his Macedonian and Persian worlds into something new. His vision was not Greek supremacy over Asia. It was something far stranger and more radical than that. An empire that contained multitudes, that transcended the categories his tutor had handed him. In this sense, Aristotle's greatest achievement as a teacher may have been producing a student genuinely capable of thinking past what his teacher had taught him. We should pause here, in the gardens at Mieza, and try to see Alexander clearly. He is perhaps 14 or 15 in our imagining. He is not yet a king, not yet a general, not yet the figure whose name will echo for millennia. He is a boy, but a boy of startling intensity. The ancient descriptions, even accounting for their rhetorical embellishment, converge on certain consistent details. He was of medium height, powerfully built rather than tall, with one eye reportedly darker than the other. One dark brown, one blue-gray or perhaps gray, a detail that Plutarch mentions and that modern scholars take seriously. He had a habit of tilting his head slightly to one side when he was thinking or speaking, a mannerism that his companions and later his biographers noticed and recorded. He moved quickly, with a physical restlessness that never entirely left him. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily attractive, and knew it with the easy unself-consciousness of someone who had been told so from birth. He was also, crucially, deeply emotional. This is not the image that centuries of heroic portraiture have given us. The cool marble face, the serene profile on the coins, the composed god-king figure. Alexander wept easily and genuinely. He wept at the deaths of people he loved, with an openness that his Macedonian generals sometimes found disconcerting. Macedonian culture valued emotional restraint in men, and Alexander's willingness to grieve publicly, to rage publicly, to celebrate publicly, was one of the things that set him apart from those around him, and made him both magnetic and occasionally frightening to be near. His emotions were not decorative. They were structural, load-bearing, fundamental to who he was. He had a temper. This too will matter later, and darkly. Aristotle surely knew it. It would have been impossible to spend 3 years in close proximity to Alexander without encountering it. The boy who would one day drive a spear through one of his oldest friends in a moment of alcohol-fueled rage was there, somewhere, in the youth sitting in the covered walkways at Mieza, listening to lectures on ethics and self-control. The ancient sources are not shy about this. Alexander's anger was legendary among those who knew him, and it is one of the elements of his character that resists the heroic framing. The reminder that greatness and goodness are not the same thing, and that the greatest men are not always the best ones. But the dominant quality, the one that Aristotle must have encountered every day, that his mother had planted and his father's conquests had watered, and the Iliad had brought to full blazing flower, was desire, a hunger so comprehensive it was almost physiological, a need to know everything, to go everywhere, to achieve the unprecedented and then look past it to see what came next. There is a story from his youth, probably from around this period, just before or just after Mieza, that captures something essential. A group of Persian ambassadors arrived at the Macedonian court while Philip was away on campaign. In his father's absence, the young Alexander received them. The ambassadors expected a child, expected to handle the meeting with polished diplomatic condescension, expected to be through with it quickly. Instead, they found themselves in the presence of a boy who asked them no questions about the wealth of Persia, its beautiful cities, or its famous luxury. He asked them about the roads. He asked about the distances between places. He asked about the military organization of the Persian army. He asked about the character of the Persian king. The ambassadors left more unsettled than they had arrived, and reportedly said to one another that this boy, this child sitting in for his father, was already thinking like a conqueror. He was not yet 16. In 340 BC, Philip went to war with Byzantium and left Alexander, 16 years old, as regent of Macedon in his absence, with his own royal seal and the full authority of the kingdom behind him. This was not a ceremonial appointment. Philip trusted his son with the actual running of an actual country, and within months, as we noted in our opening, Alexander proved that trust was not misplaced. A Thracian tribe called the Mede took advantage of Philip's absence to rebel against Macedonian authority. Alexander did not wait for his father to return. He gathered an army, marched north, defeated the Mede in battle, expelled them from their chief settlement, renamed the town Alexandropolis, Alexander's city, and repopulated it with new settlers. He was 16 years old, and he had just founded his first city. He would found approximately 70 more. The pattern was already there. The speed of action, the refusal to hesitate, the personal presence at the front of the fighting rather than the rear, the understanding that conquest was not merely military but administrative, that you didn't just defeat people, you replaced their world with one that bore your name. All of it was already present, in embryonic but unmistakable form, in the teenager who left Mieza with Aristotle's voice in his head, and Homer's fire in his chest, and his mother's divine commission branded somewhere deeper than both of them. The world had been preparing itself to meet Alexander for quite some time. It simply did not know this yet. His education was almost complete, not finished. Alexander would never stop educating himself, would never stop asking questions, never stop reaching for the next thing to understand, but the foundational work was done. The raw material had been refined into something unprecedented, a young man who combined the physical courage and tactical genius of his warrior father with the philosophical hunger and intellectual range that 3 years with Aristotle had deepened and systematized, wrapped in the mythological self-understanding that his mother had pressed into him like a seal pressed into soft wax. He was 17. He was 18. The world was still very large and he had not yet broken anything. That was about to change. The storm breaks, from Sharonir to the ends of the earth. War found Alexander before Alexander went looking for it. Or rather, war had always been present, humming at the edges of his childhood like weather building beyond the horizon. And when it finally arrived in full, He was ready for it in the way that only someone who has been quietly preparing their entire life can be ready for anything. Not calmly, not without fear, but completely. The year was 338 BC. Alexander was 18 years old. Philip had maneuvered the Greek city-states into open conflict through years of patient, brilliant diplomacy and controlled military pressure. And now, the moment of decision had arrived. The city of Thebes and the city of Athens, ancient rivals who had spent generations competing for supremacy and who had both chafed bitterly under Macedonian expansion, had formed an alliance against Philip. It was the most powerful coalition the Greek world could assemble. Theban soldiers, the finest infantry fighters in Greece, Athenian hoplites, backed by the wealth and prestige of the greatest city in the ancient world, and at the center of it, the pride of Thebes, the sacred band. The sacred band requires a moment of explanation because they were something genuinely unusual in the ancient world. 300 men, organized into 150 pairs of lovers. The idea being that a man will fight more bravely beside someone he loves than beside a stranger, and that shame at appearing cowardly before the beloved was a more powerful motivator than any abstract patriotic duty. They had been undefeated for 38 years. 38 years of the hardest fighting in the fiercely competitive world of Greek warfare. And they had never once broken, never routed, never failed to hold the line when holding the line seemed impossible. The battle took place near the town of Chaeronea in Boeotia, on a wide, flat plain ideal for the maneuvering of large infantry formations. Philip commanded the Macedonian right. Alexander commanded the cavalry on the left, the most aggressive, most dangerous, most decisive position on the battlefield, the position where the battle would either be won or lost. The ancient sources describe what happened with admirable concision. Alexander saw his moment, drove his cavalry straight through a gap in the Greek line, and crashed into the sacred band's flank. Philip, coordinating with his son across the entire width of the battlefield in an act of tactical partnership that demonstrated just how thoroughly he trusted the teenager, executed a feigned retreat on his side that drew the Athenian line out of position and created the decisive opening. The sacred band did not run. This is the part of Chaeronea that has echoed down through history. When the battle was lost, when the line had broken everywhere around them and their allies were streaming away across the plain, the sacred band stood. All 300 of them. They died where they stood, in formation, facing the enemy, not one of them willing to be the first to turn. When Philip walked the battlefield afterward and came upon the sacred band's dead, lying in their ranks exactly as they had fallen, he wept. A warlord, a hard and practical man who had built a kingdom through controlled violence and ruthless calculation, stood on the plain at Chaeronea and wept for 300 men who had chosen death over dishonor. Alexander had destroyed them. He was 18 years old, and he had just broken something that 38 years of Greek warfare had been unable to break. The stone lion that the Thebans erected over the grave of the sacred band still stands at Chaeronea. It stands today. 2 years passed. 2 years in which Alexander governed, learned, fought smaller engagements, watched his father's diplomatic machinery continue its work, and continued to exist in that restless, coiled state that was simply his natural condition when he was not at war. Then, in 336 BC, at a wedding celebration in the Macedonian city of Aegae, Philip II was assassinated. The killer was a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias, and his precise motivations remain a matter of historical debate that will probably never be fully resolved. What is not in debate is the consequence. Alexander, 20 years old, was suddenly king of Macedon. He moved with a speed that shocked the people around him, which was already becoming something of a pattern. Within days he had consolidated his position within Macedon, executed or neutralized potential rivals to the throne, and begun the diplomatic maneuvering required to secure the grudging recognition of the Greek city-states, many of which saw in Philip's death an opportunity to throw off Macedonian dominance and reclaim their independence. Athens celebrated openly when the news arrived. Demosthenes, the greatest orator of the age and the most eloquent and implacable opponent of Macedonian power, appeared in the assembly wearing a garland of flowers within a week of Philip's death, as though it were a festival day. He would not be wearing the garland for long. Alexander moved south through Greece with an army, and the celebration curdled rapidly. The Greek cities, confronted with the reality of a Macedonian force approaching their walls, concluded, with the exception of Sparta, which as always went its own way, that the new king's terms were reasonable, and his army was very much present. A congress was convened at Corinth. Alexander was recognized as hegemon of the Greek world, leader of the Pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia that his father had been planning at the time of his death. He then marched north to deal with rebellions in Thrace and Illyria, fighting a campaign of extraordinary speed and tactical innovation, at one point crossing a river under enemy fire by ordering his soldiers to row their boats in tight formation and hold their spears upright, creating a visual impression of confusion that gave him the crossing he needed, before returning south with the kind of velocity his enemies had not yet learned to account for. Because while he was in the north, Thebes had rebelled. The Thebans had received a rumor, false as it turned out, that Alexander had been killed in Illyria. They rose against the Macedonian garrison stationed in their city and laid siege to it. Other Greek cities were watching, calculating, waiting to see how the young king responded. He responded by appearing outside the walls of Thebes approximately 2 weeks after the revolt began. The Thebans, whatever they had expected, had not expected this. Alexander offered terms. Thebes refused. The battle was brief and total. The city fell in a single day. What happened next was one of the most consequential and deliberately shocking decisions of Alexander's career. He convened the Congress of Greek allies, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, the other cities, and asked them to determine the fate of Thebes. He understood, with a politician's sharp instinct, that the decision would be more powerful coming from Greeks than from a Macedonian king, and that the Greek cities harboring grievances against Thebes would not be gentle. They were not. Thebes was razed to the ground. Its population, men, women, and children, was either killed or sold into slavery. 30,000 people. Only the city's temples and the house of the poet Pindar, who had written verses in praise of Macedon's ancestors, were left standing. The message traveled through the Greek world at the speed of news, which, in the ancient world, was the speed of a fast horse. It arrived in Athens, where Demosthenes heard it with the rest of the assembly. It arrived in Sparta. It arrived in every city that had been considering rebellion. Nobody rebelled. This was not simply cruelty, though it was certainly that as well. It was calculated terror, deployed as a strategic tool. Alexander needed his rear secured. He needed the Greek world locked down while he turned east towards something that had never been attempted. The destruction of Thebes brought him years of relative stability in Greece. He would never return to Greece again. The spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water between Europe and Asia. The same water that Xerxes of Persia had crossed in the other direction 150 years before, at the head of an army that ancient sources placed in the millions, with approximately 37,000 men. The Persian Empire they were marching against covered roughly 2 million square miles and commanded resources that dwarfed anything Macedon could produce. It was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. But before Alexander did anything else, before he made contact with the enemy, or began the campaign that would consume the next 11 years of his life, he did something that tells you exactly who he was. He sailed to Troy. He went ashore at the place where, if Homer was to be believed, the Greek fleet had landed 1,000 years before. He made offerings at the tomb of Achilles. He anointed the gravestone with oil. He ran around it, naked and garlanded, as Greek tradition demanded. He called Achilles fortunate, fortunate in his death, fortunate in his glory, fortunate above all in having had Homer to sing his story. His companion Hephaestion laid a garland on the tomb of Patroclus. Achilles' great companion, the man whose death had driven Achilles back into the war and ultimately to his own glory-soaked end. The parallel being drawn was not subtle. Alexander was Achilles. Hephaestion was Patroclus. The campaign was the Trojan War, restaged on a vastly larger canvas, with the roles reversed, the Greeks advancing now, this time, into Asia. It was theatre. It was genuine devotion. It was political communication. In Alexander, these things were never entirely separable. He also, while at Troy, picked up a shield from the temple's collection of antique armor, a shield that was said to date from the Trojan War itself. He would carry it into battle throughout his campaigns. Whether it was actually Trojan-era armor is almost certainly irrelevant. What mattered was that he carried it, that his men knew he carried it, that every engagement he fought was thus placed consciously within the frame of myth and epic. He was making himself into a story while he was still living it. He was his own Homer. The first real battle came at the Granicus River, approximately a month after the crossing. The Persian satraps, the regional governors who administered the western portion of the empire, had assembled a force at the Granicus to stop the invasion before it could gain momentum. Their army included a significant cavalry force and a large contingent of Greek mercenaries, professionals who fought in the Macedonian style and who understood Macedonian tactics from the inside. The Granicus was a fast-flowing river with steep banks, and the Persian cavalry waited on the opposite bank, ranged along the high ground where the natural geography gave them every advantage. Alexander's senior general Parmenion, an older man, Philip's most trusted commander, who had been assigned by Philip to accompany the campaign as both an advisor and a check on any excessive youthful recklessness in his new king, advised waiting until morning, crossing somewhere else, finding better conditions. Alexander said no. He ordered the immediate attack across the river, led it himself, and nearly died. Near the center of the fighting, a Persian cavalry officer named Spithridates caught up with Alexander and swung at him with an axe that split his helmet and drove through to the bone of his skull. A second blow was already falling when Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's most important generals, and a man who had known him since childhood, drove his horse between them and cut off Spithridates' sword arm. Alexander's life was saved by a fraction of a second by the speed of a man who loved him. The battle was won. The Greek mercenaries who fought for Persia, fighting for pay rather than ideology, were shown no mercy. Alexander executed most of them, considering them traitors to the Greek cause regardless of how legitimate their employment had been. It was another calculated message. The cost of opposing him was total. The Persian western satrapies began to fall. City after city across what is now western Turkey opened its gates, often welcoming Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule, which for many of the Greek populations of the coast had been a foreign imposition for generations. He moved quickly, absorbing territory, appointing governors, reducing the few cities that resisted, and managing the logistics of a campaign army with an administrative competence that is sometimes overshadowed by his more dramatic military achievements. At the city of Gordium in Phrygia, he encountered the famous Gordian knot. The knot was a massively complex tangle of corn or bark bound around the yoke of an ancient wagon in the city's citadel, and it came with an ancient oracle. Whoever could untie it would rule Asia. Generations of travelers had tried and failed. Alexander examined it and, characteristically, decided the oracle had said nothing whatsoever about how the knot had to be untied. He drew his sword and cut it in half. Whether this story is literally true or embellished in its retelling, it is too perfectly Alexander not to tell. The impatience with artificial constraints, the lateral thinking, the willingness to simply redefine the terms of the problem, the theatrical flair that turned a practical solution into a legend. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled through Gordium, which his seers interpreted as divine approval. Of course it did. Of course they did. In the autumn of 333 BC, everything changed. Darius III, King of Kings, Lord of the Persian Empire, had had enough of watching his satraps fail to stop the Macedonian advance. He assembled the main Persian royal army. Ancient sources give figures that range from several 100,000 to over 1,000,000 men, numbers that modern historians regard as catastrophically inflated, with serious estimates ranging from 100,000 to perhaps 200,000, and marched to meet Alexander personally. The two armies found each other at Issus, on a coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey, where the mountains come down close to the sea, and the terrain narrows significantly. This narrowing was, in one of history's more consequential ironies, disastrous for the Persian side. Darius had chosen to march south and cut off Alexander's supply lines, which was a perfectly sound strategic move. But in doing so, he had committed his vast army to fighting in a space too confined for its numbers to be decisive. Alexander's smaller, superbly disciplined force would not be outflanked. The battle would be decided by the quality of the fighting rather than the quantity. Alexander's battle plan at Issus was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. He personally led the companion cavalry, his elite horsemen, the cutting edge of his battle line, on the right flank, as he almost always did, taking the most dangerous and decisive position for himself. His infantry phalanx held the center. The plan was to drive hard with the cavalry, punch through the Persian line near Darius himself, and create the kind of shock and confusion that would collapse the entire Persian position. The plan worked. Alexander drove straight at the Persian king, and Darius, who by all accounts was a physically impressive and genuinely brave man in other contexts, lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield while the fighting was still in progress, while his army was still capable of offering resistance. The moment his chariot was seen retreating, the Persian resistance collapsed. The consequences were enormous. In the chaos of Darius's flight, he left behind his entire baggage train. He left behind his treasury. And he left behind his family. His mother Sisygambis, his wife Statira, his daughters, his young son. The entire Persian royal household captured in a single afternoon. What Alexander did next defined his reputation for decades. He sent word to the royal women that evening. Darius was alive and had not been killed, and they should not grieve on that account. He would visit them in the morning. They should be treated as queens. And in the morning he came, with Hephaestion beside him, and because Hephaestion was taller and more physically imposing, Sisygambis, the king's mother, a woman of great dignity and presence, prostrated herself before Hephaestion first, taking him for Alexander. When the mistake was pointed out, she was mortified. Alexander's response was recorded because it was so unexpected. He smiled and said that she had made no mistake, that Hephaestion was also Alexander. He treated the Persian royal women with complete honor throughout the campaign. He paid for their maintenance in the style appropriate to their status. He arranged marriages for the daughters with respect and ceremony. When Statira died, he mourned her and gave her a magnificent funeral. When Sisygambis, many years later, heard of Alexander's death, she turned her face from the light and refused food. She died 5 days after receiving the news. There is something in that detail. A Persian queen choosing to die rather than outlive the man who had conquered her family. That says more about Alexander's capacity to inspire devotion across every boundary of culture and origin than any battle trophy. He should have marched directly for Babylon. Every military logic pointed that way. Darius was broken. The heart of the empire was exposed. Strike now and end it. Alexander went to Tyre instead. The decision to besiege Tyre in 332 BC is one of the most revealing choices of Alexander's entire campaign, precisely because it was so strategically costly and yet so completely in character. Tyre was an island city off the coast of what is now Lebanon, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, fabulously wealthy, extraordinarily well fortified, situated on a rock in the sea half a mile from the mainland. Its walls rose directly from the water. Its harbors could accommodate the Tyrian fleet, which was formidable. It had withstood a 13-year siege by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar without falling. Alexander wanted it because he needed to control the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline before moving inland, ensuring that Persia could not use its superior naval power to cut his supply lines or threaten Greece while his back was turned. This was sound reasoning. But he also wanted it, clearly, because it was the most difficult thing available to him, and he found impossible challenges personally irresistible. The Tyrians, confident in their island position, offered a compromise. Alexander could sacrifice at the temple of the Phoenician god Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, on the mainland, and the city would remain neutral. Alexander insisted on entering the city to sacrifice. The Tyrians refused. The siege began. It lasted 7 months. 7 months of one of the most sustained and inventive feats of military engineering in the ancient world. Alexander's engineers began constructing a mole, a causeway of stone and timber, reaching from the mainland out to the island. The Tyrians attacked it with fireships. They dropped boulders on the workers from their walls. They used specially designed ships to cut the ropes holding the palisade screens that protected the work. The causeway was destroyed. Alexander began again. He gathered a fleet from the subjugated Phoenician cities and from Cyprus, neutralizing the Tyrian naval advantage. He constructed siege towers on specially widened ships and brought them up against the walls. When the battering rams finally breached the wall in August of 32 BC, Alexander was among the first men to cross the assault bridge onto the wall, exposing himself to the concentrated defensive fire of an entire city, because that was where the hardest fighting was, and he was constitutionally unable to send men somewhere he would not go himself. The city fell. In his fury at the resistance, the siege had cost him time and men and resources he could not easily replace. He was not merciful. The Tyrian soldiers bound in arms were killed. The population was sold into slavery. 2,000 men were crucified along the shoreline as a warning. The same pattern as Thebes, the message identical. Resistance carried a cost that no city could afford, and mercy was offered once before the siege began, and not again. Tyre's causeway still exists. The silt and debris accumulated around it over the centuries have transformed what was once an island into a peninsula, permanently attached to the mainland by the work Alexander's engineers performed in the summer of 332 BC. The modern city of Sur in Lebanon sits on ground that was open sea before Alexander made it otherwise. He literally changed the shape of the coastline. Egypt opened its arms. The Persians had been deeply unpopular rulers of Egypt, having shown what the Egyptians considered a criminal disrespect for their gods and their traditions. When Alexander arrived in late 3030 BC, the Persian satrap surrendered the country without a fight. The Egyptian priests received Alexander not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, and then as something considerably more significant. At Memphis, the ancient capital, Alexander was crowned pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian ceremony. He made the traditional offerings to the traditional gods, including the sacred bull Apis, which the Persian king Cambyses had supposedly killed and which the Egyptians had never forgotten or forgiven. He presented himself not as an outsider claiming Egypt, but as Egypt's rightful ruler, the continuation of a tradition stretching back 3,000 years. He was 24 years old, and he was Pharaoh of Egypt. In the spring of 331 BC, he made a journey that the ancient sources invest with considerable significance and which clearly mattered deeply to Alexander himself. He traveled west along the Mediterranean coast and then turned south into the desert to visit the oracle of the god Amun at the oasis of Siwa, a journey of several hundred miles through the Libyan desert, undertaken in part by following the flight of birds when the guides lost their way, or so the story went. The oracle of Amun at Siwa was one of the most respected prophetic sites in the ancient world, consulted by kings and generals from across the Mediterranean for generations. What Alexander asked the oracle, and what the oracle answered, was kept private. He told his mother Olympias that he would reveal it to her alone when he returned to Macedon, a return that would never happen. What he told others was this: the oracle had confirmed that he was the son of Amun, the son of Zeus, divine. Whether he received this as confirmation of what his mother had always told him, or whether it surprised him, or whether the oracle said any such thing at all, and he simply reported what was most useful for him to have reported, is something no historian can determine from this distance. What we can observe is that after Siwa, Alexander's identification of himself with divinity became more explicit, more public, and more politically consequential. The question of his divine status would become one of the great fault lines of his relationship with his Macedonian commanders, men who could follow a king to the ends of the earth, but balked at following a god. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a city on the Mediterranean coast where the Nile Delta met the sea. He named it, in his characteristic fashion, after himself. Alexandria, one of the great cities of the ancient world, which would become for centuries the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, home to the greatest library that had ever existed, the city of Cleopatra and of Caesar, of philosophers and scientists and poets. It exists today, a modern city of 5 million people on the Egyptian coast, still carrying the name of the young man who walked its future streets in the spring of 331 BC and planted the stakes that would mark its boundaries. He would found approximately 70 cities in his career. Alexandria in Egypt was by far the most enduring. Gaugamela, October 1st, 331 BC. On a wide plain in what is now northern Iraq near the city of Arbela. This was the battle that ended the Persian Empire. Darius had spent the time since Issus rebuilding his forces, and this time he had chosen his ground with great care, a broad, flat plain where the Persian numerical advantage could be fully deployed, where there was no narrowing terrain to limit his flanks, where his cavalry and his scythed chariots could maneuver freely. He had even had the ground leveled and cleared of obstacles in the days before the battle, to ensure his chariot wheels would not catch on anything. Alexander arrived, surveyed the Persian position from a hill, and reportedly stood there in silence for a long time, studying the disposition of an army that his scouts estimated at 200,000 men or more. His senior general, Parmenion, looking at the same sight, suggested a night attack to offset the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander refused. He would not steal a victory, he said famously. He would win it in the open. Whether this is true or a later embellishment, it achieved its effect. The story of the king sleeping peacefully before the greatest battle of his campaign became part of the Alexander mythology, a demonstration of superhuman composure that his men carried into the fighting with them. The battle began with the Persian scythed chariots charging the Macedonian infantry line. The Macedonian soldiers had been trained for exactly this. They opened lanes in their formation and let the chariots through, then closed around them and killed the drivers. The chariots caused almost no casualties. Alexander watched the Persian line carefully. He advanced obliquely, angling his entire battle formation to the right, toward the edge of the prepared ground, drawing the Persian left flank to follow, stretching their line. He was waiting for a gap. He found one. A moment when the Persian left had moved far enough to create a seam between their cavalry and their center, and he drove into it with the companion cavalry at full charge, leading from the front as always, aiming directly at the position where Darius stood in his command chariot. Darius saw him coming, and Darius broke again. There is genuine tragedy in Darius III, which the sources acknowledge even when writing from Alexander's perspective. He was not a coward. He had been thrust into the kingship unexpectedly, had done his best to resist the most capable military commander of the age, and had failed twice. At Gaugamela, he turned and fled for the second time, and in doing so, he ended his empire. Alexander wanted to pursue him immediately, but a crisis on his left flank, where Parmenian's forces were being overwhelmed by Persian cavalry, forced him to wheel and relieve the pressure first. By the time the battlefield was secured, Darius was gone. Babylon opened its gates. Susa opened its gates. Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, with its vast treasury and its monumental palace complex, fell in January of 30 BC. At Persepolis, Alexander did something he would later claim to regret. At a banquet, reportedly drunk and reportedly encouraged by the Athenian courtesan Thais, who argued it would be fitting revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century and a half before, he set fire to the palace of Xerxes. The fire spread and consumed much of the great complex. Some historians believe it was a deliberate political act, a symbolic declaration that the Persian Empire was over. Some believe the ancient sources that call it drunken, impulsive destruction. Perhaps both are true. What is beyond dispute is that Persepolis burned, and that one of the great architectural wonders of the ancient world was reduced to the ruins that you can still visit in Iran today. The great carved columns standing in the desert, the processional reliefs depicting the tributary peoples of the empire bringing their offerings, the monumental gateways leading now into open sky. Darius died in the summer of 30 BC, not at Alexander's hand, but at the hands of his own men. A group of Persian nobles led by the Bactrian satrap Bessus conspired against the king during the retreat, stabbed him, and left him in a cart to die. Alexander, riding in pursuit, came upon the cart too late. Darius was still breathing. There is a scene in Plutarch, one of the most evocative in all of ancient biography, impossible to verify and impossible to dismiss, in which Alexander found Darius dying and covered him with his own cloak. He offered him water. He wept. What did Alexander weep for? The end of the pursuit. The loss of an enemy whose defeat had been the organizing purpose of the entire campaign. Something more complicated. A grief for a man who had twice run from him and twice been left to the consequences, whose humiliation was now complete and permanent. We cannot know, but the tears, whatever their precise source, were real. They were always real with Alexander. He gave Darius a royal funeral, with full Persian honors, at the royal tombs at Persepolis. He then declared himself the legitimate heir to the Persian Empire and the avenger of Darius's murder. Bessus had taken the title of King of Kings. Alexander would hunt him down over the next 2 years through the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. The years between 30 and 327 BC represent the most grueling and in some ways the most revealing period of the entire campaign. The organized Persian Empire was finished. What remained was a series of regional resistances in the vast territories of Bactria and Sogdia, roughly modern Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics, where the terrain was brutal, the winters devastating, the enemy tactics entirely different from the pitched battle warfare at which Alexander excelled. This was guerrilla war, fought across mountain passes and river valleys, against enemies who would not stand and fight, but who melted into the landscape and struck when Alexander's forces were extended and exhausted. He adapted. He learned. He divided his forces into multiple independent columns that could cover more terrain. He built a network of fortified cities to hold conquered ground. He fought in winter, when no one expected him to fight in winter, crossing mountains in snowstorms to attack positions the defenders had assumed were safe until spring. He was shot through the shoulder by an arrow in Sogdia and commanded the next day's operations with the arrow still in him, while his surgeons debated whether it was safe to remove it. But these years also revealed the fractures in Alexander that the unbroken string of victories had papered over. He executed Philotas, the son of his general Parmenion, on charges of treason that most historians now regard as at best ambiguous and at worst fabricated. And then, because Parmenion, the great general who had served Philip and Alexander with total fidelity, was too dangerous to leave alive with his son dead at the king's order, Alexander had Parmenion killed in Ecbatana without trial, a man who had fought beside him for a decade, cut down by messengers carrying orders from a king who could not face the conversation directly. It was not his finest hour. And then there was the night in Marakanda, modern Samarkand, in 3028 BC, when Clitus the Black died. Clitus, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. Clitus, who had known him since childhood. Clitus, who got very drunk at a banquet and said things that drunk men say when they have accumulated grievances for years and the wine has finally dissolved the restraint. He said that Philip's achievements were being diminished by Alexander's historians. He said that Alexander owed more to his father's Macedonians than to his own brilliance. He may have said, or implied, that Alexander's divine pretensions were absurd. Alexander, also drunk, also with accumulated grievances, some of them entirely legitimate, others the suspicious paranoia of a man who had been worshipped and flattered for too long, threw a spear. The spear killed Clitus instantly. What followed was one of the most remarkable and disturbing passages in all the ancient accounts. Alexander collapsed. He pulled the spear from Clitus's body and reportedly tried to drive it into his own throat before his bodyguards restrained him. He retreated to his tent and lay there for 3 days without eating, weeping, calling Clitus's name, repeating the name of his mother. The mother of Clitus, who had been Alexander's nurse when he was a child, who had dreamed a prophetic dream about her son's death the night before. His court philosopher Anaxarchus eventually came and talked him back from the edge, delivering a speech about how kings were beyond conventional moral judgment, an argument that was philosophically interesting and morally repugnant in roughly equal measure. Alexander eventually emerged. He went on. But something had changed, and the people around him knew it had changed, even if they were not entirely sure what it was. In the winter of 327 BC, in Bactria, Alexander married. Her name was Roxanne. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, a man whose mountain fortress Alexander had taken by having his best climbers scale the rock face at night. He had called for volunteers by promising rewards to the first men to the top, and 300 of them had come forward, and 12 had died in the attempt, but the fortress had fallen in the morning. Oxyates surrendered. His daughter was among the captives. Ancient sources describe Alexander as falling genuinely in love with Roxane, and the marriage, conducted with full Macedonian ceremony, rather than simply treating her as a concubine, which would have been the expected approach for a conquered chieftain's daughter, was both a personal commitment and a political masterstroke, binding the Bactrian nobility to his cause through the oldest diplomatic tool available. His Macedonian officers were perplexed, and in some cases offended. They had followed him to the end of the world, and he was marrying a barbarian girl in a ceremony that looked disturbingly like he meant it. He did mean it. Roxanne was the only person to bear him a child. A son, Alexander IV, born after his father's death. She was not the last political marriage Alexander would make, but she was the only one that appears to have involved anything resembling personal attachment. India. In 326 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush and the Indus River and entered the subcontinent that the Persians had known as the eastern edge of the world, and that Greeks had imagined as the place where the earth met the ocean that encircled everything. He fought a dozen engagements and skirmishes in the Punjab, absorbing territory, negotiating with some kings and crushing others. And then, in the spring of 326 BC, he met Porus. Porus was a king of the Punjab, a man described by the ancient sources as physically enormous, over 6 feet in height, towering above Alexander by nearly a foot, and in possession of an army that included something Alexander's forces had never faced in serious numbers before: war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes River, the river now called the Jhelum, in what is now Pakistan, was in many ways Alexander's most tactically complex and demanding victory. He could not cross the rain-swollen river in front of Porus's waiting army. The elephants alone would have destroyed any crossing attempt. He spent weeks conducting feints, moving forces up and down the river in the dark, sending parties across at various points to desensitize the Persians to the sound of nighttime river crossings, until finally, on a stormy night, he took a picked force 17 miles upstream and crossed where the enemy was not watching. By morning, he had an army on the wrong side of the river, and Porus was turning to meet it. The battle that followed lasted most of the day. The elephants were devastating at first. No horse would willingly approach them, and the Macedonian cavalry had to fight constantly with their mounts' instinct to flee. But Alexander had prepared his infantry for exactly this, and the phalanx could do things to elephants that cavalry could not. They cut the animals' hamstrings. They drove wedges between them. The elephants, maddened by pain, began turning on their own forces. Porus fought until his army was destroyed around him, wounded in multiple places, still mounted on his elephant because the animal refused to abandon him, lowering its trunk to the ground so its king could dismount safely when the fighting was finally over. Alexander rode forward to meet him. He asked how Porus wished to be treated. Porus, bleeding from multiple wounds, standing in defeat before the man who had just destroyed his kingdom, said, like a king. Alexander restored him to his throne. Why? Because Alexander, for all his capacity for calculated terror, for the destruction of Thebes, for the massacre after Tyre, for the cold ordering of Parmenian's death, also had a genuine appreciation for excellence that transcended politics. Porus had fought brilliantly, with total commitment, on impossible terms. He had answered Alexander's question with the dignity of a man who had not been broken by defeat. That was enough. More than enough. Porus became one of Alexander's most loyal regional allies. Alexander founded 2 cities on the banks of the Hydaspes, naming one of them Bucephala, after his horse Bucephalus, who had carried him in battle since his youth, and who died on the banks of this river. Very old for a warhorse, simply done. Alexander wept for his horse as he had wept for fallen friends, and he built a city in his name. And the name of that horse is still known today because Alexander loved him and made him immortal in the only way available. Beyond the Hydaspes lay more India, more kingdoms, more battles. The river Hyphasis, modern Bees, and beyond it, more of the world. Alexander's army refused to cross it. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They had crossed deserts and mountain ranges and rivers without names. They were far from their families, many of them bearing wounds that had never properly healed, wearing out their boots and their armor, and their patience in a campaign that showed no signs of ending because their king simply could not conceive of an ending that was not the edge of the earth itself. Alexander tried everything. He argued. He appealed to their honor. He withdrew to his tent in furious silence for 3 days, refusing to speak, hoping their loyalty would overcome their exhaustion. It did not. His general Coenus, one of his most distinguished officers, stood before the assembled army and spoke for them. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their parents and their wives and their children. They had given everything. They had followed him everywhere. Let it be enough. Coenus died a few days later of illness, which meant Alexander never had to find a way to live with the complicated feelings of a man who loved you and told you no. The army still would not cross. Alexander sacrificed to the gods and proclaimed the omens unfavorable for advancing further. He turned south toward the sea. He had not reached the edge of the earth. He would never reach the edge of the earth. The man who could face any army, break any wall, endure any physical hardship, had finally encountered the one thing he could not overcome: the collective exhaustion of the men who loved him. He turned south, and the vast Indian subcontinent continued east without him, unaware that it had just survived Alexander the Great, the long return, descent, loss, and the death of a god. He turned south, but he did not turn gently. There is a quality in certain people, those who have organized their entire psychology around forward motion, where being stopped feels not merely like inconvenience but like a kind of death. Alexander had been stopped, not by a wall or an army or a river in flood, but by the love of his own men, which was the only force on earth capable of halting him, and which had done so with a finality that no battle could have managed. The army would not cross the Hyphasis. The world would continue east without him. He accepted this. He had no choice. But acceptance for Alexander was never a passive condition. He descended the Indus River toward the sea with his full army, and he fought every step of the way. The campaign down the Indus Valley in 326 and 325 BC was ostensibly a strategic operation, clearing and consolidating the territories between the Hydaspes and the ocean, securing the eastern boundary of the empire before the withdrawal westward began. And it was all of those things. It was also, unmistakably, the expression of a rage that had nowhere else to go, the channeled fury of a man who had been told he had gone far enough and who intended to demonstrate through sheer violence that he had not. He fought the Mali, a fierce warrior people of the lower Punjab, in the winter of 326 BC. The Mali's principal city was fortified and defended by soldiers who had no intention of surviving, and Alexander's forces moved through them systematically until they reached the inner citadel. The scaling ladders brought up against the walls were crowded with soldiers, and there was a delay. Too many men, the ladders bending and cracking under the weight. And Alexander did something that his generals and his bodyguards had been watching for and dreading for years. He climbed the wall himself. He reached the top, stood on the battlements, and found himself essentially alone. 3 men had made it up with him, and the weight of the others had broken the ladders behind them. Below him, on the outside of the wall, his army screamed at him to come down or to wait. On the inside of the wall, the Mali began to collect beneath him in numbers that had only one possible end. He jumped down into the city. He landed inside the walls with 3 companions, Peucestus carrying the sacred shield from Troy, Leonatus, and a 3rd man, against the entire garrison of the citadel, and he fought there, in a corner against the wall, until his men broke through the gates. He killed the Mali commander with his own hands. An arrow struck him in the chest, driving through his breastplate and into his lung. He went to one knee. Peucestus stood over him with the shield of Troy, and fought to keep him alive, while the Macedonians broke through the gate and killed everything they found in a fury so complete and so total that the ancient sources use the word slaughter with unusual directness, even by their standards. When they reached Alexander, he was sitting upright, blood filling his lung, watching his men save him and being unable to help. They were weeping. He was trying not to. The arrow's removal was one of the most dangerous medical procedures of the ancient age. The shaft had to be cut free while Alexander remained conscious, and as still as possible, with the knowledge that the lung might fully collapse the moment the arrowhead was extracted. He gripped the sides of the operating table. The arrow came out, and with it, a spray of blood and air from the punctured lung that convinced the men watching that he was dying on the spot. He did not die. He was 29 years old, and his body, which had absorbed axe blows and spear wounds and arrows in a decade of constant fighting, refused once again to give up. When he appeared on his ship's deck a few days later, pale and visibly diminished but standing, the banks of the Indus erupted with the sound of his army's relief. Men ran into the river up to their waists, reaching toward the ship, touching its hull, throwing flowers into the water. Veterans of a decade of war wept on the riverbank because their king was still alive. He had terrified them. He had always terrified them. In this particular way, the certainty that one day, the battle they were watching from the flanks, the wall he had climbed ahead of them, the river he had crossed first, would be the one that finally killed him. That day had nearly come. In the scarred walls of the Mali citadel, it had nearly come. He reached the Indus Delta and the ocean in the summer of 325 BC. He sailed out into the open sea, past the last point of land, and made offerings to the gods at the place where the river met the deep water. He drove his spears into the waves and prayed to Poseidon, asking the god of the sea to carry his soldiers safely home. He had reached the ocean. He had come as far as the world went. He turned west. What came next was the worst thing Alexander ever did, not the worst thing done on his orders. The destruction of Thebes, the execution of Parmenion, the death of Clytus were all arguably worse in their individual human costs. But the Gedrosian desert crossing was the worst thing Alexander ever chose to do, because he chose it knowing it would be devastating, and the damage fell entirely on the people around him. The route home from the Indus ran through the Gedrosian desert, modern Baluchistan, in southwestern Pakistan and southeastern Iran, and ancient sources were clear that the desert was extraordinarily hostile. Cyrus the Great and Semiramis of Babylon had each attempted to cross it with armies, and had each been destroyed by it, surviving only with remnants of their forces. Alexander knew this. He chose the Gedrosian route anyway. His stated reasons were strategic. He wanted to march parallel to the fleet commanded by his admiral Nearchus, which would be sailing along the Macron coast, and to establish supply depots along the coast to provision the ships. This was true. It was also incomplete. He wanted to do what Cyrus and Semiramis had failed to do. He wanted to add it to his account. He wanted, even in retreat, to exceed the previous limits of what was considered achievable. The army entered the desert in the late summer of 325 BC, which was precisely the wrong time of year. The heat was extraordinary. The water sources were separated by distances that tested the absolute outer limit of human endurance. There was almost no food. The guides lost their way. A flash flood in a dry riverbed killed hundreds of soldiers, and, perhaps most heartbreakingly, most of the women and children who had been following the army, family members of soldiers who had accompanied the campaign for years. By the time Alexander emerged from the Gedrosian desert 60 days later, he had lost more soldiers to thirst and heat and starvation than in any battle of the entire campaign. Modern estimates suggest he may have lost between 1/4 and 3/4 of the force that entered. The precise number is unknowable. What is known is that the army that came out of the desert was a shattered remnant of the one that went in, and that the men who survived never entirely forgot what had been asked of them in those 60 days. There was a moment during the crossing, recorded by multiple ancient sources in terms too consistent to dismiss. That has become one of the defining images of Alexander's character. A scouting party found a small spring in the desert and filled a helmet with water and brought it to Alexander, who had gone without water for as long as his men. He took the helmet. He looked at the faces of the soldiers around him, who had nothing. He poured the water into the sand. If he could not drink, he would not drink. What his men suffered, he would suffer. The soldiers who watched him do it were not grateful exactly. They were too thirsty for gratitude. But they understood. The gesture went through the army like a current. They told the story for the rest of their lives. He emerged from the desert into Persia in the autumn of 325 BC and discovered that his empire had been running in his prolonged absence on the assumption that he might never return. What he found was corruption so widespread and so brazen that it could only have been sustained by governors and administrators who had genuinely believed that the king was gone and accountability with him. Satraps who had raised private armies, looted the treasuries they were meant to protect, and in some cases committed atrocities against the populations in their care. Officers who had been trusted with enormous resources and had stolen them as thoroughly as their positions allowed. Alexander's response was swift, systematic, and pitiless. He began to execute. Satraps, treasurers, military commanders, men who had served him for years, some of whom had been personally appointed by Philip before him. He moved through his empire's administrative structure like a fire through dry grass, removing and punishing with a speed and totality that shocked even the people who had been expecting consequences. Some of the executions were undoubtedly just. Some were almost certainly excessive. Alexander's judgment, never entirely stable when it came to perceived betrayal, was further destabilized by the Gedrosian crossing and by an increase in his drinking that those around him had been watching with anxiety for some time. Alcohol had always been part of Macedonian court culture, as it was part of Greek culture generally, but in these years after India the drinking became heavier, the nights longer, the hangovers more violent, the moods more unpredictable. He also, in this period, began pushing harder on the question that had been fracturing his relationship with his Macedonian officers for years, the question of how a man who ruled an empire of Persians and Greeks and Egyptians and Bactrians and 100 other peoples should present himself to his subjects. Alexander wanted proskynesis. This was the Persian court custom of prostrating oneself before the king, falling flat on the ground, or at minimum making a deep bow, as a gesture of submission and reverence. In Persian culture, it was a political gesture, not a religious one. But in Greek and Macedonian culture, prostration before a person was an act of worship reserved for gods, and asking a free Greek to perform it before a mortal king was, in their understanding, not merely undignified but obscene. Alexander had been gradually adopting Persian court customs for years, wearing Persian dress on certain occasions, incorporating Persian noblemen into his administration and his military units, maintaining the Persian royal household in something like its traditional form. His Macedonian commanders had tolerated this, uncomfortably. The proskynesis demand was something different. It was asking them to treat him as a god. The episode in which the philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's own nephew, whom Alexander had brought along as the campaign's official historian, publicly refused to perform proskynesis and was subsequently arrested, tortured, and killed on charges of involvement in a conspiracy against the king's life, sent a message through the Greek and Macedonian intellectual world that was as clear as the destruction of Thebes had been to the Greek political world. There were limits to what Alexander would tolerate, and those limits were becoming harder to identify with any certainty. The man who had wept for Darius, who had restored Porus to his throne, who had poured his water into the desert sand, was also a man capable of killing his own historian for embarrassing him at a dinner. Susa, 324 BC. Alexander organized a wedding of extraordinary scale and political ambition. He married Statira, the eldest daughter of Darius III, a union that made him, dynastically and symbolically, the heir to the Persian throne, as well as its conqueror. In the same ceremony, he married a second Persian princess, Parysatis, daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes III. But the wedding was not merely his own. In a single mass ceremony, 80 of his senior officers were married to Persian noblewomen, the daughters and sisters of Persian nobility, assigned with the careful attention to status and alliance that only a king organizing imperial policy could manage. Alexander provided dowries for all of them. He also announced that he was recognizing the 10,000 children born to his soldiers and their Asian companions during the campaign as legitimate, and would provide for their education and eventually their enrollment in his army. He was building a hybrid ruling class for a hybrid empire. He was, quite literally, trying to breed a new world. His Macedonian officers went through the ceremony with varying degrees of enthusiasm and near immediate regret. Most of them would quietly set aside their Persian wives after Alexander's death. But in this moment, at Susa, the vision was still alive. An empire that was neither Greek nor Persian, but something new. A fusion of the best of both worlds, administered by men who carried both cultures in their blood, united under a king who belonged wholly to neither and was attempting to belong wholly to both. It was, depending on how you look at it, either the most radical and prescient political vision of the ancient world, or the project of a man who had been away from home so long and accumulated so much power that he had begun to lose his grip on what was actually possible. Perhaps it was both. At Opis on the Tigris River, later in 324 BC, the tension that had been accumulating for years finally broke. Alexander announced that he was releasing the Macedonian veterans, those too old or too broken by wounds to continue in service, and sending them home to Macedon under the command of Craterus, one of his most trusted generals. It should have been welcome news. It was anything but. The announcement was the spark that ignited everything the Macedonian soldiers had been carrying for years. The resentment of the Persian customs, the fury at being asked to prostrate themselves, the sense that they were being replaced by the Asian soldiers Alexander had been incorporating into the army's elite units, the sheer accumulated exhaustion of men who had followed a king to the literal edge of the world and back and who felt, in some inchoate but deeply felt way, that they were being discarded. They mutinied. They told Alexander to go fight his wars with his father, meaning his divine father Zeus, since he seemed to prefer divine parentage to Macedonian brotherhood. They said everything they had been not saying for years. Alexander's response was volcanic. He leapt down from the platform where he was speaking, personally identified the ringleaders with his own hand, and ordered their immediate execution. Then he went inside and refused to see anyone for 2 days. When he emerged, he announced that he was reorganizing his entire army on Persian lines. The Macedonian units would be replaced at every level with Persian soldiers. Persians would hold every position of honor and trust. His Macedonian veterans could go home if they wanted, since he no longer required them. The bluff, if it was a bluff, worked. The veterans broke. Thousands of men who had fought for him for a decade came to the doors of the palace and stood there weeping, refusing to leave until he came out and spoke to them. He came out. He wept too. He could not stay angry at them. He never could. Not for long, not at his soldiers. He held a reconciliation banquet. 9,000 men sat together. Macedonians and Persians, the old army and the new. And Alexander made a prayer that has survived in summary in the ancient sources. A prayer for harmony between peoples, for the sharing of power, for a future in which Macedonians and Persians would govern together as partners, rather than conquerors and conquered. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable political speeches in the ancient world. A king asking his empire to become something it had never been. A man who had conquered through violence, appealing for a peace more durable than conquest. He meant it. He always meant it, which is the thing that makes Alexander so difficult to judge from a safe historical distance. The sincerity coexisted with the violence, the vision coexisted with the cruelty, the love coexisted with the rage, and none of these things cancelled each other out. That autumn, in Ecbatana in Media, Hephaestion died. He had been Alexander's closest companion since childhood. They had grown up together in the palace at Pella, studied together under Aristotle at Mieza, crossed the Hellespont together, laid garlands side by side on the tomb at Troy, one on Achilles' grave, one on Patroclus's, the great hero and his beloved companion. They had been together through every battle, every crisis, every city founded, and every fortress taken, for more than 20 years. The ancient sources are careful and somewhat circumspect about the precise nature of their relationship, as ancient sources often are on such matters, but they are unanimous on one thing. Alexander loved Hephaestion more than he loved anyone else, more than his mother, more than Roxanne, more than any of the men and women who passed through his long campaign with varying degrees of closeness. Hephaestion was the person for whom the word companion was not adequate, the person whose presence made the entire enterprise feel, in some private corner of Alexander's psychology, worthwhile. Hephaestion fell ill with typhoid fever in Ecbatana and died after a week. He was 32 years old. His doctor was later crucified on Alexander's orders for failing to save him. What followed was the grief of a man for whom grief had no appropriate container. Alexander cut off his hair, as Achilles had cut his hair over the body of Patroclus in the Iliad, the parallel he had been living toward his entire life, arriving now in its darkest form. He lay on the body for the better part of a day, refusing to be separated from it. He ordered mourning throughout the empire, demanded that the sacred flame at the Persian temple of Ecbatana be extinguished, an honor reserved for the death of kings. He sent to the oracle at Siwa asking whether Hephaestion could be honored as a god. The oracle said he could be honored as a divine hero. It was not enough, but it was something. He commissioned a funeral monument of extraordinary scale and expense. Ancient sources describe plans for a pyre so vast and so elaborately decorated that it would have been one of the largest structures in the ancient world. Whether it was ever built as planned is uncertain. What is certain is that Alexander spent the remainder of his life in a state of grief that the ancient sources describe as qualitatively different from anything they had witnessed in him before. Not the intense, expressive grief he had shown at other deaths and had then moved through, but something foundational, a loss that seemed to remove some essential structural element from his architecture as a person. He moved and campaigned and planned. But the light had changed. He threw himself into a winter campaign against the Cossayans, a mountain tribe in the Zagros range, fighting through the cold months in what Plutarch described with unusual directness as an act of grief, killing as a way of doing something with feelings that had nowhere else to go. He was 32 years old, and he had been at war for the better part of his adult life, and he had just lost the person he loved most in the world. And the Cossayans were there, and they were hostile, and war was the only language in which Alexander had always felt completely fluent. He subdued the Cossayans in 40 days. In the spring of 32 BC, he turned toward Babylon. Babylon was to be the capital of the unified empire he had spent 11 years building. Not Pella, not any Greek city, but the great city of the ancient world at the heart of the conquered territories, a place that belonged fully to neither his Macedonian nor his Persian inheritance, and could therefore belong to both. He had grand plans for Babylon, harbors to be expanded, canals to be dug, a fleet to be built that would explore and eventually circumnavigate Arabia, New campaigns projected westward into the unconquered territories of North Africa and the western Mediterranean. Carthage, the Italian peninsula, perhaps eventually the Pillars of Hercules and whatever lay beyond. His imagination had not contracted. His body had. He arrived at Babylon in late May of 3023 BC. On the road approaching the city, the Chaldean astrologers, Babylon's famous astronomical priests, whose records of celestial movements stretched back generations, and whose predictive abilities were regarded with great seriousness throughout the ancient world, met him outside the walls and warned him not to enter Babylon. The omens were terrible, they said. The city faced west. He should approach from the east, enter with the sun behind him, avoid the city's great shadow falling across his path. Alexander attempted to detour around the city to enter from the east. The terrain was impassable marsh. He entered from the west. There are other omens recorded in the ancient sources in these weeks. A lion that broke free in the palace and was found dead. A stranger who sat on the royal throne unchallenged while the guards inexplicably looked away. Birds falling from the sky around the city walls. The ancient writers invested them with the weight of prophecy after the fact, which we should acknowledge. But we should also acknowledge that Alexander himself was clearly aware that something was wrong with him, in ways that no omen could adequately name. He was drinking heavily. He was sleeping poorly. He was in mourning that had not diminished in the months since Hephaestion's death. He had been wounded seriously multiple times in the preceding years, including the chest wound from the Mali city that had punctured his lung, and the cumulative damage of a decade of the most physically demanding warfare imaginable, was sitting on a body that was only 32 years old in calendar terms, but considerably older in operational terms. He planned, he organized, he received ambassadors from across the known world. Libya, Carthage, Etruria, Spain, the Celts, the Scythians, peoples from the edges of every direction, who came to Babylon because Babylon was where Alexander was, and Alexander was where the world's center had moved. He dispatched survey missions. He made sacrifices. He began the preparations for the Arabian campaign. In the first days of June, he attended a banquet given by his admiral Nearchus, a celebration in preparation for the coming campaign. He drank heavily, as he had been drinking heavily for months. The next day, he was feverish. He refused to stop working. He continued meeting with officers, giving instructions, planning the Arabian expedition, even as the fever climbed. He was Alexander. He had been wounded through the lung and come back. He had crossed the Gedrosian desert. He had survived everything the world had thrown at him for 32 years, and he would survive this. He did not survive this. Over the following 10 days, the fever intensified. The ancient sources describe him being carried to the riverbank, then carried back. His officers grew alarmed, then frightened, then desperate, in ways that men who have followed someone since childhood become desperate when they begin to understand that the following is almost done. A rumor spread through the army that he was already dead, and his soldiers, the veterans, the men who had been with him since the beginning, demanded to see him. They were let through his chambers in a line, one by one, filing past the bed where he lay, and he acknowledged each of them individually, raising his eyes or his hand in recognition, not able to speak clearly any longer, but wanting them to know that he saw them, that he knew them, that they had not been forgotten. He never lost consciousness entirely until the very end. The Macedonian officers gathered around his bed and asked him to whom he left the empire. The ancient sources give him several famous last words at this point, none of which are certain, all of which feel like the kind of things people need a great man to have said at the moment of his death. The most frequently repeated is that he left his empire to the strongest, and that he could foresee great funeral games arising after his death. Whether he said this, or anything so coherent, is genuinely impossible to know. What is known is that he died in Babylon on approximately June 10th or 11th, 3023 BC. He was 32 years old. He had been king for 13 years. The silence that fell over Babylon when Alexander died was described by the ancient sources as total. Not the silence of absence. Tens of thousands of people were in and around the city, but the silence of people who had no idea what to do next, because the person who had always known what to do next was gone. His generals gathered. They were already measuring each other with different eyes. His body lay unburied and unattended for 6 days while the dispute over succession consumed everyone who might otherwise have attended to it, and the ancient sources report, with a detail that reads as too strange and too specific to be invented, that when the embalmers finally came to prepare the body after 6 days in the Babylonian heat, they found it showing no signs of decomposition. The ancient world took this as confirmation of his divinity. Modern physicians have proposed that he may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a condition that can cause progressive paralysis while leaving the patient conscious, and which can produce a state so similar to death that premature burial was historically possible. The possibility, remote but not dismissible, that Alexander of Macedon was not dead when his generals began fighting over his empire has been discussed with increasing seriousness in recent decades. That he may have been conscious, aware, unable to speak or signal, while the world he had built began immediately to destroy itself around him, we cannot know. The ancient world did not know. His doctors, if they suspected, left no record. What happened afterward is both the ultimate confirmation of Alexander's greatness and the most brutal possible commentary on its limits. His empire, which he had spent 13 years building and 11 years expanding, and which he had dreamed might become something genuinely new in the history of the world, a unified, multicultural, hybrid civilization administered by men trained in both Greek philosophy and Persian governance, lasted in any meaningful sense for approximately 2 years. His generals, the men who had been his companions at Mieza, who had ridden with him at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, who had stood weeping on the banks of the Indus when he was wounded by the Mali, began killing each other with a thoroughness that would have been impressive in almost any other context. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, consumed the following 40 years of the ancient world. A cascade of assassination and conquest and shifting alliance, in which nearly everyone who had known Alexander personally died violently. Roxanne, his wife, had their son quietly, a boy named Alexander IV, who was immediately declared co-king alongside Philip Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, and who was accordingly a target from the moment of his birth. He was 12 years old when Cassander, the son of Antipater, whose tension with Alexander had been visible since the days at Mieza, had him murdered. Olympias had already been killed by that point, forced to her death by Cassander with a viciousness that the ancient sources record with evident discomfort. Hephaestion's great funeral monument was never completed. Perdiccas, who had been given Alexander's signet ring in the dying king's last conscious gesture, was killed by his own officers. Ptolemy stole the body of Alexander during its transport to Macedon and brought it to Egypt, where he was building his own kingdom, understanding with a showman's instinct that possession of the body of Alexander conferred legitimacy that no military victory could match. The body was eventually installed in Alexandria, the city that bore Alexander's name, where it became a pilgrimage site for the ancient world's great men. Julius Caesar wept there. Augustus accidentally broke off part of the nose while leaning in to place a garland on the mummified face. Caligula reportedly stole Alexander's breastplate and wore it. The tomb's location was eventually lost sometime in late antiquity and has never been found. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Alexandria, the greatest conqueror in the history of the ancient world may still be lying, unlocated, unreachable, 300 feet from the Mediterranean coastline in a city that still carries his name. What do we do with Alexander? The question has occupied historians and philosophers and military strategists and moralists for 2,300 years, and it has not gotten simpler with time. He was a man who founded cities that still exist today, that have housed millions of people across millennia, that became centers of learning and commerce and culture that shaped the world long after the man who planted their founding stakes was dust. He spread the Greek language across the known world so thoroughly that when the books of the Christian New Testament were written 3 centuries after his death, they were written in Greek, the shared language of his conquered territories, because that was the only language that could reach everyone. The cultural synthesis he forced between Greece and Persia created the Hellenistic world, the intellectual and artistic environment in which mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy made advances that would not be surpassed for centuries. He was also a man who destroyed Thebes and sold 30,000 of its people into slavery, who executed men who had served him faithfully because he was drunk and frightened and could not separate legitimate threat from imagined one, who drove his army through the Gedrosian desert and lost a quarter of it or more to the ambition of doing something Cyrus the Great had failed to do, who had a philosopher killed for embarrassing him at a dinner, who may have been a functioning alcoholic in the last years of his life, the drinking accelerating the instability that was always present, and that absolute power over millions of people had no mechanism to check. He is not a hero. He is not a monster. He is something more uncomfortable than either. A human being of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary flaws, operating at a scale where both the gifts and the flaws had consequences measured in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and where the line between vision and delusion, between genius and madness, between love and obsession, was never entirely clear. His mother told him he was descended from gods. His tutor told him what excellence looked like. His father showed him what conquest looked like. Homer told him what glory looked like, and he spent 32 years running toward all of it simultaneously, never stopping, never satisfied, piling victory on victory and loss on loss and achievement on grief, in a life so compressed and so relentlessly accelerated that its full weight is almost impossible to hold in the mind at once. He asked, as a child, what his father was leaving him to conquer. By 32, he had conquered more of the world than any man before him, and had begun to understand. In the long nights in Babylon, in the months after Hephaestion died, in the fever that was coming for him with the patience that all things eventually have for all people. That conquest was not the same as fulfillment. That the edge of the earth was not a place you could reach, that the gods do not actually descend to help their favorites in the dust and blood of the critical moment, whatever his mother had promised. He was a boy who wanted to be a myth. The world accommodated him in the end, more completely than he could have imagined. He became one. He became the standard against which generals and emperors and kings measured themselves for 2,000 years and usually found themselves insufficient. He was Alexander. He was not enough for himself, and he was more than enough for the rest of human history. The torch he threw across the ancient world is still burning. You can see its light in the cities he founded, in the language he spread, in the cultural crossroads he forced open, in the stories that cannot stop being told about a boy from Macedon who looked at the known world in the 4th century before the Common Era and decided, with the serene unreasonableness of someone who had been told since birth that limits were for other people, that he would simply have all of it. He nearly did, and we have never entirely gotten over the part where he didn't.